If you want news and rumors that appeal, welcome to the Dusty Wheel.
Hey, welcome back to the Dusty Wheel. Good night from the Dusty Wheel. Like we say around here, smash to black.
If you want news and rumors that appeal, welcome to the Dusty Wheel.
Hey, welcome back to the Dusty Wheel. Good night from the Dusty Wheel. Like we say around here, smash to black.
If you want news and rumors that appeal, welcome.
Hey, welcome back to the Dusty Wheel. I'm your host, the Innkeeper, and this is our live call-in talk show all about the Wheel of Time. Today, this Sunday afternoon, we're here to talk about trauma in the Wheel of Time. But before I introduce my guest, before we start talking about that topic, I want to remind you about 2 episodes coming up here at the Dusty Wheel. First, this Watt Wednesday, we are back, just like we are every week, talking about special and visual effects when it comes to the Wheel of Time with someone you all know really well, Lauren, or Unraveling the Pattern. Lauren's going to be here. We're going to be talking. Basically, I think of it as special and visual effects for dummies. He gets to tell me all about all the things I don't know when it comes to building out effects for the screen. So that'll be a lot of fun. Be back here Wednesday. And then a special episode this Thursday. We're going to be live with Brandon Sanderson here at the Dusty Wheel, talking about the Wheel of Time, the Cosmere, and everything that's going on with the state of Sanderson. There's a lot. I don't know if you know, he just started a podcast because why not, right? Right, Brandon? I can't wait to talk to him about that particular new thing that he's been doing. So now, before I welcome my guests, I want to thank you all for showing up here today to talk about and explore with us trauma in the Wheel of Time series. The 3 members of this panel that I'll introduce here shortly all have hands-on experience in working with individuals, families, and systems that have experienced trauma. Now, we hope to benefit fans by having a frank and engaging discussion on the subject. But, there's a disclaimer we want to put out here. We're not here to diagnose characters in the Wheel of Time. We want to normalize this conversation and destigmatize the topic. So to do that with me, let me welcome my wonderful guests today.
All right. Oh,
Hello, everybody.
yeah.
How about now, everybody? The audio should have been fixed. It happens. It's a live thing. So let me do this again. I should probably introduce you all since they might not have heard my introductions here. So they haven't heard anything since the guests were shown. Okay, so great. It is fixed. Everyone's happily can hear me now. They just saw me speaking about this. So my first guest here is Christine. Christine is a fan of the books and is also at the tail end of her master's in clinical mental health counseling. Ryan, who many of you know from the Way of the Leaf YouTube channel, has a bachelor's degree in psychology and special education teaching credential and over 20 years experience working with children and adolescents in both mental health settings and as an educator. And last but not least, Mickey is also a fan of the books and works as a licensed clinical psychologist. So thank you all for being here. All of you are much more experienced in this topic than I am, which is great for me as a host because I get to ask all sorts of questions that I don't know anything about. So thank you all for being here. I really appreciate it. Now, before we jump into this topic, I want to just, as a reminder to everybody, this is a highly public forum, not a safe space for discussing your own trauma history in the chat or in comments. So please refrain from sharing personal stories there, though obviously empathetic expressions are fine. And above all, we'd ask that the viewers will treat each other, like I said, in chat and comments with respect. And if anything comes up that you believe you could use additional support in dealing with your own trauma, we've put some links in the description of this video where you can get some resources and support there. So with that being said, we ended up talking about this topic, Ryan, because we had a viewer of the show, many of them know Master the Deck, who had seen an episode that you had done where you had talked about trauma. And honestly, this is a topic as a reader that I hadn't. It's not that I didn't feel compassion in some form or fashion for things that characters are going through in the Wheel of Time, but I think I used it more as escapism and enjoyment than worrying too much about the things that were taking place to those characters. At least I started reading the books when I was 15. So why does this topic mean something to you then? Trauma and the Wheel of Time.
It means a lot to me because I have a lens that's specific to my background, so through my working with children on the limits of experiences, experiencing very, very severe things at an early age, helping children through that has really kind of put a telescope on my mind, and I see the world through the lens of personal kind of individual resiliencies and what happens to us when we go through our worst moments. And clearly this series has our characters going through the worst moments on a fantastic level. So it led to a great discussion, and there's just so many different ways to address it. So it's really fun to talk about.
Yeah, no, I agree. And maybe for the purposes of this discussion, Mickey and Christine, do you want to help kind of frame trauma? I think all of us have different ideas of what trauma might mean. And so I don't know, Mickey, if you want to go first, maybe help our viewers frame what they should think about when we think about the word trauma.
Sure, that's such a great question because it's one of those words. I think I use this example a lot. It's like love, right? We use this word as if we understand what we're talking about when we use the same word, but it can mean really different things to different people, right? I love pizza is really different than I love my child. And so trauma is kind of the same way. It's a really broad spectrum of experience. A brief definition of it is that it's anything that overwhelms our ability to cope. And so one thing that one person might experience as traumatic may not actually be experienced as traumatic for a different person. And so it can really be very personal and varied.
Yeah. And Christine, anything else you wanted to add to that when it comes to framing trauma?
I think Mickey pretty much explained it. Trauma is very subjective to the individual who's experiencing it. And it's also something like grieving that doesn't have a time limit. So I think a lot of times, you know, when it comes to traumatic events or traumatic experiences and coping or not coping with trauma, people tend to lose their compassion over time and expect people to just sort of get over it. And it doesn't really work that way, which we sort of see over and over again in the Wheel of Time. And we sort of see what can happen when you don't address or deal with trauma in a healthy way.
I mean, maybe speaking to that, is there something that's coming to mind or a particular character where you just immediately, when you think about that idea of people, you know, telling somebody just to get over it, or, you know, maybe not given space to deal with trauma, is someone coming to mind for you?
I think Rand is the obvious
Sure.
example there, where he just experiences trauma after trauma after trauma and is never given an opportunity to process any of his traumatic events. And then the way that it fractures his close relationships and how difficult it is for him to open up to people, or for people to really accept what he's going through, and to treat him with the empathy that he would probably benefit from as he's dealing with all these different traumas. I think that's a prime example.
And can I add in there too?
Yeah.
Because I think Rand is such a great example of it, because I mean, his arc is just beautiful, because I don't think I'm trying to think if anybody actually, other characters tell him to get over it, but he tells himself that all the time. And I think we see that for folks a lot who've experienced trauma, is they think that they should just like get harder, get stronger, get tougher, and not be impacted by this stuff. And we see that it doesn't work for Rand to do it that way.
Yeah, interesting point that you made, that often we're the ones that drive ourselves to get over it, if you will. Whether or not that's socially driven or something. In this way, you know, Rand believes that that's what he has to do, is just get over it. So,
he was getting these messages from Lan. Lan very much was early on just trying to harden him, and telling him about duties and telling him, I don't remember this phrase, get over it, but like he was just like,
It was implied.
You need to do, sheepherder.
Yeah, well, that's interesting that you had brought up Lan in that regard, because I think a lot of our own narratives about how to deal with trauma come from, you know, the people that we're either raised by or mentored by. And Rand certainly found a mentor in Lan, right? And Lan did lead him towards addressing it in a certain or a specific kind of way. You know, and maybe that's, at least for me, looking at this topic, you hear this a lot, like, what's a healthy way to deal with trauma, or what's an unhealthy way? And I want to say, I mean, like, I'm sure all three of you have examples from the books, more so than my brain isn't like bringing like really great examples in the moment. But Rand, for example, would you call that an unhealthy way of addressing trauma, which is hardening your kind of self to the things you've experienced?
Go ahead.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, so yeah, I think this is when we talk about coping, right? The thing about coping is that pretty much anything can turn into an unhealthy coping strategy. So something that's healthy for one person, like say you have a really tough day and going home and having a glass of wine would be a really good way to manage a tough day. Yeah. Great. Maybe not the best way for another person. And so that gotcha. Hardening up that we see with Rand, I think we can juxtapose that with what we see Egwene doing, like especially when we hear and we're going full spoilers for this, right?
Yeah, so that's great question. So yeah, let me remind everyone, it's the perfect time. If you're watching this, we're talking, we'll likely touch on the entire series. We may even touch on other series out there, you know, so this is going to be a full spoiler. If you've listened to this conversation, you're like, oh, this would be great. But yeah, no, we're going to be talking about things, the arcs, the narratives that are, you know, that our characters have gone through. And yeah, this is going to go all the way to the end. So just know there's going to be spoilers all the way to the end of the series. I think I've given people enough warning. Hopefully they've dropped off at this point. Go back. Go ahead, Mickey. Thank you very much for bringing that up.
Because the point I'm going to bring up with Egwene is after she's back in the White Tower when she's been captured, and she is beaten repeatedly in that case, right? And so she goes through a form of toughening up, but it's accepting, it's leading into the pain. And I think that's a phrase you often hear in like treatment and stuff, is like leaning into, as opposed to Rand, who just kind of like braces against the pain he's experiencing.
Well, can you explain that a little bit for people that are watching? Like, what is that? I think we can intuit the idea of leaning into something versus bracing from it, but maybe explain that a little bit more deeper.
Well, again, I think the description of Egwene going through her experience in the tower is a really good example of that. She doesn't try and fight the pain she experiences when she's in the Mistress of Novice's office, right? And she's getting the strap. She experiences the pain. She lets herself cry. She knows that she's hurting, but she's able to kind of fully experience it and then experience it passing. Right. Whereas Rand, I think we see him experiencing his pain, but he tries to hold on to it as a way of making himself strong. If we think about the list that he goes through in his head, he almost beats himself with that list as a way to grab and hold the pain. And as we see in Rand's arc, like what that does, it ends up making him more fragile and more easily fractured at the end, where Egwene becomes actually stronger and able to handle some really, really difficult situations.
Well, and for Rand, I think too that list almost becomes like a dissociative mantra for him. Mm-hmm. Whenever he experiences, that horrible sense of guilt over someone dying, particularly a woman dying, instead of doing what Egwene does, embracing that pain, processing that pain, and then allowing it to wash over him and wash away, he just sort of blocks out the processing part and then just repeats that list over and over and over and over again to separate himself from that moment.
Almost like a child rocking in a corner.
Yeah, it's almost like a stereotypical type behavior where it's just like he's trying to reset and get back to some sense of normalcy. But as you mentioned, we see that it doesn't help at all. It's just this unprocessed trauma that then comes to a head at various times. So that's definitely more of a maladaptive.
Yeah. I mean, if he had a list of all the people he saved going on in his head every night, I'm sure he'd wake up in a better mood. Yeah.
Right. Yeah, there is a certain. Yeah, maybe that's again. This is me coming from novice. Maybe that is the leaning into the experience a bit more so. It would be understanding and trying to process, yes, the things that are happening versus focusing on one aspect and just standing in that aspect and not moving from it, becoming immovable. Right. In this case, perhaps and perhaps this goes to the point, Mickey, you were making, which maybe Lan was able to take the strategy in some ways at some point earlier on. Maybe it was a good strategy at a time that, like you said, maybe that cup of wine is for one person okay, but it's not something you can just pass to everybody else and say, this is how you solve this problem. And maybe that's a little bit of what we saw happen there. Like, this is the way you do it, and in the process, maybe it was okay for a moment, but there was no additional training. There was no additional help. It was just like, do this forever. And he stayed there. At least that's how I'm taking in what you're all saying. So.
Well, and I think for Lan too, it doesn't really even work for him, because by holding on to all of that, it keeps him from forming attachments with other people, as we see with his relationship with Nynaeve.
Yeah, and Lan is such a significant. I mean, this maybe it's just epic fantasy, or they put people into these incredibly unimaginable situations, right? And truly, for Lan, he's like fighting. He's going to the blight every day, almost like embracing death, and against these monsters. There's just something almost fantastical about it, and he's able to push through. And then he bonds himself to an Aes Sedai. He's bonded to an Aes Sedai, and he has almost superhuman capabilities that allow him to, do this over and over again. So it is an interesting question of, is Lan also experience the same arc as Rand? Do you see that? Do you see similarities in that kind of hardening? I'm kind of curious how we see Lan in this lens.
Like does
Yeah.
Nynaeve do for Land that Tam does for Rand? Is that what we're proposing?
Yeah, is there? Yeah, do we see a little bit of that happening? Did Robert Jordan kind of create that parallel in those experiences?
I think so. And Ryan, this is making me think about your experience, because I'm thinking children intuitively know, right? When they're overwhelmed, they turn towards, they find someone that they identify as safe, and then they move towards that person. And I think you're right. You're describing these two characters who have been told they need to turn away from their important to others. And then, yes, Nynaeve and Tam both become those objects that they can turn back, people they can turn back towards.
And who remind them about like their true motivation that's external and not their own like personal trauma narrative that they're reliving every day. Like this seems like they had these people intervening at just the right moment to get them to be able to like really transcend their own issues to be able to do what they needed to do at the end.
Yeah, and maybe this is an interesting way to segue not away from these topics, but just to the, at first I said, sometimes it's your mentors or the people around your life that might teach you the bad, way, or they might just hand you a way that worked for them. It doesn't work for you. In this way, would you also say that it is the people in your life that can also offer, meaning to enable you to move, to lean into the trauma and process it? For example, Tam and Rand, we have to look at that relationship at the end of the books or near the end of the books, and how much Tam was a driver for Rand to remain here in life and to understand all the things he had gone through. Do we all play an important role in other people's processing of their trauma?
I think so. I think with regard to Tam and Rand, and with regard to trauma in general, it's very easy to identify with your trauma and say that this is who I am. I am a traumatized person. I am whatever it is that, you're experiencing in that moment. And with someone like Tam, who's very grounding, is a very grounding influence for Rand, he's able to say, not explicitly, but to say, you are Rand, you are my son. Trauma, this is something that you experienced and dealt with, but it's not who you are. This is who you are. And I think that grounding and that reminding Rand is what saves him in the end.
Yeah. When you say grounding, is that like a term we should understand? Like when you say grounding, yeah, does that relate? In other words, again, I intuit what I think I understand, but is that something related to mental health discussions? Is grounding a topic that comes up?
Sort of. It's not necessarily like a technical term, but it's, but I think it's something that everyone can relate to, right? Coming back to your sense of self and remembering who you are, and that your experiences don't necessarily define you at your core, but they are something that you can get through and deal with.
Yeah.
Go ahead.
I would add too, on the grounding thing, it is something that we train people to do when they're recovering from trauma or experiencing it and learning to experience it in a new way. And grounding can be anything that brings you back to the here and now, because the thing that we experience with trauma is it can also often take us out of the present moment. It takes us back to that moment. And I think sometimes even when we think about, Rand's dissociative list, I really like you framing it that way, is that that's him kind of leaving the present moment. And so coming back to where you are, and it can be something as simple, and I'll even say for people who are watching right now, like sometimes even having this conversation, you might not realize, oh, this is kind of bringing up some stuff for me right now. And if we want to ground ourselves, come back to the present moment, you can do something as simple as just like look around your space, like pay attention to what's around you right here and now. And that can bring us back to the moment. And I'll add another layer to that. And is that I think this is the beauty of art too, is sometimes we can't come back to the present moment. Sometimes that just feels like too much. The present moment is overwhelming. And so this is where art and fantasy and literature is so powerful. And I think a lot of us use it as a way to escape, not in a bad way, because we talk about sometimes coping, strategies can be really healthy, and escape into a fantasy world can be a really great way for us to ground and get back to ourselves, get back to our core sense of self by being able to see other people experience things that may be traumatic, but we have that we're a little bit removed from it.
Yeah. Do you see that, Ryan, in your experience using, I don't know if it's using the escapist nature of fantasy itself, but have you found that as a common experience where that you know people that you work with that are using this fantasy world as a way to process through some of the trauma they've experienced?
It's hard to get epic fantasy with children. The children I work with don't have the type of attention span to even like sure. 14 books. F you. But But I have there's so many uses of story and narratives that I've used throughout my work, and helping children create fantastical narratives of their own so that they can indirectly get at the monsters in their life. And I've done sand tray therapy, which is definitely ways where children are putting in their unconscious experiences through play. So it ties in, but yeah, I've yet to be able to use epic fantasy in my work in any way. But
I didn't think about that.
I don't. Yeah,
I always forget that. I always forget there's people that don't want to read these 14 books. I know they exist apparently. So no, it's fascinating to me that grounding that can happen in escapism. I've always thought of escapism as a negative. I always said it had like a negative connotation to it. Does that make sense? Like I've certainly used it, and I think there's probably been positivity that came from that. But I've certainly, when I hear the word escapism, probably when I use it with my kids or whatever, I'm probably applying a more of a negative connotation than maybe I should. And that's what I'm kind of hearing here, where it can actually be a very positive tool for us as individuals to use to lean into the kind of the trauma that we've experienced and attempt to process it. Is that I'm seeing some shaking of heads.
Yeah,
that seems
I'm trying to imagine someone reading this series and not intimately relating to at least one character.
Yes.
There's so many amazing narratives and so many POVs and so many such skill put into these people. It's hard to imagine that anybody who's watching this has been like, what? I didn't really, relate to these people. Yeah. I related, and to go back to that original question, in my professional work, I don't use it. In my personal life, yes, like it's been one of the greatest coping mechanisms I've used in my entire life, is to escape into books, and I've been doing it my whole life.
Mm-hmm. I want to bring up this question from chat. I think this is a great question right around what we're talking about. For those that are watching, just like me, we use the phrase processing grief. Is there an interpretation or can we describe what that even means to the viewers, so people can have an idea of, if they don't have, kind of intuit what that means to them? Like Christine and Mickey, do you have anything where you say, what does process grief mean?
Yeah, that's such a good question. I'm trying to think about how to answer that without getting too technical. But here's what I can think about, right? Like processing an experience, whether it's grief or trauma, is different than just talking about it. It's a form of metabolizing it, so a form of creating change in their world. Right. And so we've all had that experience, right, where something's happened to someone and we want to talk about it because we're just talking about it. We're in that feeling of like, ooh, kind of drama. And we're going to talk about it, which is different than talking through something which helps you feel like you get a better understanding of it, or you have a better sense of control. Sometimes we have experiences that make us feel like we've kind of lost some of our grip on ourselves and on the world, and processing it would mean talking about it or moving through it. It doesn't even have to be talking. I think about talking all the time, but yeah, exactly. Thanks, right. Working through it in a way where you change happens.
Yeah, that's good. I think that gives more that gives more definite, like, as in that's a very much more actionable way that I can understand that. And so I'm assuming you viewers can understand that. Yeah, that helps a lot. Did you want to add anything, Christine, to that, or Ryan?
I think that's pretty succinct. I mean, I think you've summed it up pretty well. The only thing that maybe I would add is that when you are in the throes of dealing with trauma or something like PTSD, where there's sort of this hamster wheel that starts turning in your head, where you are constantly in a state of hyper awareness and hypervigilance and hyper arousal, you don't ever have time to really think, like, because all you're thinking all the time is about this trauma that you have to be so aware, and you're just so keyed up all the time. And I think when you're dealing with someone, or if you yourself are experiencing trauma in that way, being able to take a break from it and just sort of let that hamster wheel slow down and maybe stop for a while, so you can actually think about moving on to something else, right? It's not all consuming. That's sort of what the processing part is. Or like when Oprah coined that whole aha moment phrase, that's sort of what processing is too, where your brain is able to sort of step away from the hamster wheel and then reach a conclusion, right? Or reach some sort of closure where you can go, oh, aha, that's what I need to do. Or, oh, that's why I did that. Or that's how I can feel better about this. So I would say that's sort of the difference between being in the throes of a traumatic event or the experience of a traumatic event that had happened to you, and then being able to sort of process it and move through it.
So that's really helpful, because I think Rand is a good example of this, right? Rand talks about what his issue is, but he doesn't. There's the understanding of it, the leaning, the processing of it, right? Reaching an aha or understanding of it. That's not. He just brings it up. It's just returning to that space, and then you see Min try to ground him, like, "Hey, you're here. Look around the room,
shining a light on him."
Yeah, I mean, I think that relationship every once in a while gets taken off into a different part of fandom that I'm not really fond of, but I like it as part of this conversation, which is that she recognizes that he needs to be grounded in the here and now, and she does attempt that. That's like, she's like, focus on what we can address here, or who we are. And I know who you are, and stay in this moment with me. And you can see from those moments where he has a hard time staying there. So anyways, that both of these conversations are getting me to kind of go into the books and go like, oh, okay, yeah, these are good examples where I can kind of see that happening in the books. So yeah,
you're processing it.
Yes, yeah, exactly. Well, again, like I said, I think I always approach the books like, cool. Well, when I was younger, it was like, yeah, adults suck and life can kind of suck sometimes, whatever. You know what I mean? And that was like, and I think I probably hunkered down into the idea of my traumas or pains. And it wasn't until I got older that I understood that that's not helping me. So I never looked at the book. I don't think I saw these things as clearly. Now that you're all describing them and talking about them, you're seeing these things show up. Do you think, Ryan, that Robert Jordan, I don't know, this is hard to say, but
I was going to hope you asked me this question.
That that he did this on purpose. In other words, do you see the mind, the overt evidence here of somebody writing trauma narratives and writing kind of the problems that we enter when we have trauma, and how to process those things?
I think he did. I also wish he kind of added more of the opposite narratives, maybe, to kind of counterbalance it, because it does seem that he's very much highlighting, the joke online is that this could have been 3 books if these boys could have just learned how to talk about their feelings, right?
Yeah, that's true.
So so like that, so obviously he wrote it so that they make bad choices, and I believe he's highlighting them. But I also don't know if he really successfully shows us right choices very often, I think. Or someone really like going through the trauma and having to do what a typical anyone watching the show right now, or anyone talking right now, has to do. If we get experience trauma, it's a whole it's a whole thing, right? We might be stuck for years. We might not, we might end up homeless. There's so many things happen, like the spiral, that the snowball falls from trauma if it's not dealt with correctly. And Robert Jordan writes these amazingly traumatic things, and then the characters just move on. And so I think for us to go to this book for the escape is positive, but I actually don't know if I'd ever recommend these books for someone who is experiencing trauma as something that they could go to and learn and relate and be better off for having read them. I'm better off having read them because of the escape, and I loved it all, but I didn't go there to, get healing from anything I was dealing with, if that makes sense. Because I don't think that's necessarily in these books. And we could you guys feel free to disagree with me, but I have a hard time. The only one I could even think of is maybe Tam at the very end, but that's a really long arc to get to. That's it's a hard payoff.
No, that's true, because there's a significant amount of trauma. As we were talking about having this episode, I started thinking, like, I was even before when we were having a conversation about talking about this topic, and I know we've focused a little bit on Rand at this point, but there are other people in the books who are experiencing a significant amount of trauma. Does anyone? I mean, are there other characters that you think have a trauma narrative that's kind of worth discussing, specific, outside of Rand, when it comes to the books? Mickey, Christine, is anyone coming to mind where you're like, actually, this person? All of them? Did you say? Yes. Yeah. Right. That's true. Is there anyone that I guess maybe you are inspired by, as far as how they dealt with their trauma? Rand it's a tough one. It's a long arc of maybe. Not until the end is there this kind of understanding that he gets to. But is there somebody you actually look to and say, this is a great one that shows somebody that understands how to do this? Anyone coming to mind?
Well, I mean, Sanche.
Oh, interesting. Okay. Why do you bring up Swan?
Well, I mean, she had the most horrible thing she could ever imagine. Most women who go through that, like, they don't want to live, right? So she was able to rally and take that and still, like, push forward to her life's goal. But yeah, I mean, but she just kind of did it by being crazy, forcing. She just kind of pushed through everything. She's gonna push through. It's hard to see anything that, like, anyone can really relate to and learn to. Maybe I don't always feel like I can just push through things like she did. Anybody else have a better example?
Yeah, is there a view to kind of look at where you actually see resiliency and inspiration for how they handled it as opposed to others?
Yeah, and Nynaeve is the one I think that pops out for me.
Nynaeve.
She tries so hard to be hard. And like one example that I like to use when I talk about the difference between being hard and being strong, right? Glass is hard. It's very, very hard, but it can only withstand so much pressure before it shatters. Whereas something like a willow tree branch is supple and it bends, right? It's maybe a little bit stronger. It's going to bend and kind of move and then eventually come back to itself for the most part. And for Nynaeve, I think she tried really hard to be that piece of glass and to be so hard when in fact she was terrified of being shattered by anyone or anything. And so then that's what made it hard for her to channel, to open herself up to the source spontaneously. She had to sort of have this huge release of emotion in order to tap into that freedom that allowed her to channel. And then when she gets to that point where she is on the ship and the ship starts going down and she finally realizes, I'll never see land again. Like, this is it. I'm done. And she surrenders to all those fears. She just, instead of holding on to them as a source of strength, she surrenders, and then boom, she opens up and reclaims her sense of self and her power and her agency. And then, we kind of know what happens from there. And then Land sees it and finds her and all of that. So I think for Nynaeve, that moment of surrender, which maybe in her way was how she sort of processed her own fears and her own things that were holding her back, gave her the ability to sort of move on and move forward and deal with things in a healthier way.
Yeah, that's a really good one. Mickey, was there somebody coming to mind?
Yeah, couple of them, but I'll agree with Ryan too. I don't know that. I mean, and again, it's a fantasy story. It's about
Right.
like all of this stuff happening. So I think it would probably be a much more boring book if it was written about people effectively coping with their trauma.
I mean, maybe.
A lot shorter.
A lot shorter.
Probably, yeah. They talk to each other. They work together, but I do like Egwene's arc. I'm an Egwene fan, and I do think that while there are definitely mistakes Egwene makes, and I want to hold too that all of our main characters are young. I mean, we're talking late teens, early 20s, still developing and figuring out the world and stuff. And so, you know, in that context, I think Egwene does something that I see a lot of people who have post-traumatic growth experience, which is she finds something she can conquer, that she can feel a sense of accomplishment about, and she does it over and over again, right? Like, I'm going to be the best Dreamwalker, I'm going to be the best Amerlin, I'm going to do this, but I don't think she loses herself in it. She still kind of remembers who she is at the core, and I think that's as good of an example as I think we're going to get in a fantasy series.
Sure. Yeah. No, like you said, I was, as you were talking, I was like, could you make a fantasy series where everyone has great coping skills and it's still 14 books long and really compelling? You know,
like you could be like a level 20 communicator.
Yeah, exactly. Well, it brings up to me this point that, and again, I want to thank Ryan, because this question came up from a conversation we were having earlier in the week about thinking through this, and the question was like, what is the prevalence of trauma? And I was like, I don't know, I don't have the numbers. So we went and looked it up. It's a lot, you know. I mean, it's from all the research out there, and of course research varies and stuff, so we're best guesses are between 70 and 90% of people will experience traumatic events within their lifetime. Wow. But, you know, only 4 to 9% would meet diagnostic criteria for anything that would be at that level of like, I want to be gentle in this, right? Because, like, you know, we can all benefit from getting support. So it's more than just getting support, but like meeting diagnostic criteria. And so what I want to say is, like, we could still write a fantasy series where people experience trauma, and I think about 70 to 90% of the people in this book series do. And it would just be nice to see some of them dealing with it maybe a little more thoroughly.
We could have Rand going to therapy like Tony Soprano. It made for a great show.
Yeah, Wheel Talk podcast keeps talking about wanting a therapy, Aja, and I'm all for it. You know, that's.
Shouldn't that be somewhat Yellow's? I mean, I wonder, like, that's something that's not something that Jordan really explores, but you would think that would have come up. I don't know. A therapy Aja, you'd think it would exist. It's odd that it doesn't.
I think so. Would it be like a blending of like blue and yellow? Be like some sort of aqua Aja?
Aqua Aja. There we go. We just decided Aqua Aja is our therapy Aja for those that are watching. Rafe is going to add that. It's going to piss off everyone, you know, to the Wheel of Time TV series.
You can blame me.
There's now an Aqua Aja. What is interesting, and I saw this just show up here in chat talking about the Age of Legends. You know, there is this idea, right, that if we could just perfect the world, then all of the trauma and all of the would go away and people would be fantastic at it. But the Age of Legends doesn't prove that out. You know, it's like even a Nirvana doesn't prove out that they're somehow we're absent trauma and an absent need of dealing with it. In fact, the Forsaken kind of proved the point that trauma is something. Well, that's what Jordan's Least describing in his book, that it still exists. Do any of you pull anything from the Age of Legends? Is there anything to be learned from the experiences of those people there as compared to Rand and others? Is there anything that comes out of the Age of Legends? Mickey, I'm seeing you kind of shake your head.
I mean, I'm looking down at Christine because I'm like, I know we geeked out about this a while ago. Because okay, so Grendel, perfect example, was apparently the best at mental health clinician of the age, which implies that they needed that, right? So
Right.
even in Nirvana, there was this need for somebody who could address mental health concerns. And then things clearly went south there, right? We look at Semirog and Grendel and like what they end up doing with their powers and the trauma they cause. And so I don't know where I'm going with this, but yeah, I think the Age of Legends pretty shows us that, you know, even in a utopia, you can experience pain.
Well, I mean, and Jordan made a point
No
of
code of
making.
ethics.
Sorry, go ahead. What are you saying, Christine?
I was just going to say there's clearly no code of ethics that these
Right.
people here too, right? Like there was no informed consent. There was no like independent review board. There was nothing. Like they were pretty much on their own. So it's almost like that old saying that absolute power corrupts absolutely. And I think, you know, Grendel and Messana are like really good examples of that. That, you know, here are these people who are sort of, there's nothing tying them to the higher good. They can pretty much just sort of do whatever they want to, and so they do, which is unfortunate.
But Jordan makes a point of making these characters have those careers in the Age of Legends, right? He you know, I mean, I guess you could say it was just casual. He's just like, whatever, just pick a bunch of careers we have now. But to pick someone that then becomes a Forsaken, you know, and that uses their understandings to then injure other people, you know, it is quite startling when we talk about trauma in that way, right? That the Forsaken end up becoming some of the greatest purveyors of the trauma to the entire world, you know, and, you know, the Dark One being this influence that wasn't there necessarily during the Age of Legends, and not like trauma didn't exist, but certainly amplified the traumas that were going on, the breaking of the world, right? That is a traumatic event. You see not only the breaking of the world, but then you see what happens to the Aiel, right? Like we're, you know, if we transcend the conversation from just people, you have like what becomes like generational, like trauma narratives that Jordan embeds in his story. In fact, you know, I think to me, the Aiel is one of the most startling of them all, is this whole idea, you know, of this ancient sin that they're all, you know, and the threefold land is a, you know, almost a punishment of sorts in it, but it's also a preparation, you know, for this time in the future when this trauma that they've experienced and then they've been paying for in some ways, then going to resolve itself. You know, do any of you have any, like when you think about groups and kind of generational trauma, you know, do the Aiel stand out? Are there others? You know, any other comments kind of about trauma as it kind of transcends just a single person?
In my reread now, I've been focusing kind of on this issue because I was so hyper focused on the character development in the first read through. So now I'm focusing on like the world building, and I'm seeing how he's creating like different societies with their kind of their like hiccup. It's either like a sin they have to deal with or some sort of like false narrative they have to overcome, something on a bigger level. And I've been thinking about modern life. And one of the greatest parallels I'm finding with Aiel is the post Berlin Wall Germany. And the idea that if you go to Auschwitz, they have this notion that they have a guilt that they will never be able to get rid of. And they actually, it's considered guilt pride now. So they've created an identity of guilt where, I mean, I'm generalizing, please, if you're German, but this is my understanding is that the attempts is to create an identity of where everyone understands that, you know, the Nazis were bad and we're never and we've done bad things and we will never be able to pay this guilt back ever. That's kind of the idea. And I feel that's what the Aiel are kind of living out with it. Yeah.
That's I mean, have you seen this, Mickey? I don't know, where guilt is somehow like familial, trauma is familial, trauma is cultural.
Yeah. I mean, yes. I think about like certain religious identities that people hold, and guilt becomes almost kind of like wrapped up in the religious identity that people move forward with, and so Yeah, and it's interesting, right? Because guilt's not a bad thing. And I will hold, like, for myself, I don't think any emotion is a bad thing. Emotions serve a purpose for us, right?
Yeah.
The purpose of guilt is to help us identify harm that we've caused and then take steps to try and make amends for that harm. And we often compare it to shame, where shame is really, it becomes about a self-identity, instead of, like, I stepped on your toe and I feel badly that I caused you pain for stepping on your toe. Shame is, I'm a horrible person because I stepped on your toe. And it's interesting to me, thinking about it right now, that shame is such a big piece of the IEL culture and world, and how much they work to try and avoid shame or work off shame, but that they do hold this, like, larger cultural guilt that they carry around with them.
Yeah, it's a shared. Yeah, it's interesting because it's like this, almost like you both have brought up, there's an identity related to it. Like, it almost becomes just part of the, it's that we talked about that thing where you hunker. I can't remember what word you used. First is lean
into, yeah.
But the other word was like you hunker down. I don't know. It was a different word you'd used.
Bracing yourself.
Yeah, bracing yourself. Where the identity is almost like bracing yourself is the identity. This is, and it is a lack of, an absence of moving. With the IEL, right? When people understood their history, you had all sorts of numbers of things, the way that people dealt with their trauma in that moment. And Jordan kind of lays out a variety of different ways of what that means to the IEL. And it's fascinating just to see how, you look at the Shido, and then you look at, you even just look at the wise ones that do stay, like, there's still a certain amount of identity or trauma that's going on there, but they're pushing through because they're going to still want to, they have a goal and they're going to still push for it. So are there any other, I know, Christine, are there any other groups in the Wheel of Time where you think you see a significant amount maybe of trauma related to either group or identity that Jordan's embedded?
I would say the converse of the IEL would be the Tinkers. And I think it's a really good example too of, and this is something that we had discussed earlier, it's a really good way of looking at how different people or different groups process the same root trauma or the same root traumatic experience. You have the IEL who become this warrior society, and they feel like that's how they're going to deal with this unpayable debt for the harm that they caused historically. And then you have the Tinkers who kind of go the other way and say, nope, we're gonna return to peace. We're gonna return to our roots. We're going to live a completely different lifestyle, even though they come from the same core group initially. The way that they splinter off and process things is very, very different, which I think is interesting, because if you look at things in the field like twin studies, right, where you have where you have a set of identical twins who experience the same types of trauma, and then maybe they deal with it in different ways, because we're all individual. And so the way that we process trauma is highly individualized. And then even with group traumas, right, you have different people are going to relate to trauma differently, and then they sort of fracture off into groups based on how they relate to other people. So
this is a dumb question. Are there's studies on twins and trauma? Like, I don't know why that sounds extremely compelling to me, but now I want to look.
We can't tell you.
Oh my
we
God.
Can't tell you how we get that information, but it is happening.
It's not even publicly available.
No.
Are you guys messing with me? No,
Google it.
I've never thought about looking up, again, trauma and then understanding just, looking at using twins. I mean, it makes sense. Yeah. But trying to understand trauma and the roots of it and how it affects. Oh yeah, interesting. So sorry.
Twins,
just like,
no, it's just as a blanket point. Twin research has given us some of the greatest understandings of personality. It's around. It's amazing what they can do. But
yeah, no, it's really interesting. Any other groups that we see where Jordan has embedded a certain sense of identity related to trauma that are remarkable to any of you?
Yeah, what about the Shanchen?
Oh
Sure.
yeah.
No.
Sure.
Okay,
Yeah, speak
yep,
to that.
yep.
Like, so yeah, what comes to mind when you say that?
I mean, like forced slavery and identities that are wrapped up around. Oh gosh, I like it's so much that it's like colliding in my mind at this moment. I don't know if either you could speak more eloquently than I am at this moment about it.
Yeah.
Well, yeah, the idea that the Sildam's channel, right? That's the biggest kind of secret that they've been carrying around. That, right? That's kind of what I think of it.
I didn't even think about that. I didn't even go there. The idea that some maybe are aware of they could be pulled into, like, wait a second, that like, destroys their idea of identity. Hadn't even gone there. I was just stuck on the demane,
Well, and that's more shame-based, right?
Yeah.
Yeah.
That's a good example of a shame-based trauma, where they are ashamed, because if it turns out that they can channel too, then oh my God, who am I? I should be chained up too. It completely strips them of whatever social status that they have. So
yeah. And that they use them then to create to inflict trauma on others. I even just think about the testing or how they find out if a man can channel, like it's a game, like it's like gladiatorial. We're going to put this collar on you and see if you both die. And so it's like it's rooted in trauma.
Yeah, and just what Egwene shows us that she experiences, right? The creation of the identity, right? Taking your name away, giving you a new name, and there's so much obvious because it's happening to them almost in their minds more so. I mean, obviously there is physical nature to some of that trauma that happens, but the mental nature of that trauma, the control that other people have over them, and to the point of actually having people create new identities for them, and these identities they live with, and some appear to not embrace, it might be the wrong word, but become that person, over hundreds of years of just trauma, inflicted trauma. It's one of the, to me it's the, I don't, gross is the wrong word, but it's just the kind of the sickest version of the trauma that I think that we see in the books. Is just hundreds of years of being enslaved, and the Shanchan. Sheesh, that's sorry.
And it's not just the Damane and the channelers in there. It's the whole culture. I mean, if we think about the structure of leadership from the top down and the Crystal Throne, and how the children of the Empress are expected to brutalize each other. There is sort of this larger cultural expectation of violence, and that violence is equivalent to strength, or shows that you are an adept leader, versus it being what it is, which is it's power control.
I didn't even think about that. Yeah, just in general, it's a culture rooted in, the trauma of survival, in that culture, and of having a place. Yeah, go ahead, Ryan.
You could almost argue, or I want to ask, right, what culture besides the Tinkers doesn't follow that? Like, even from the very beginning, the Two Rivers is brutal. Like, Nynaeve's walking around just smacking 90-year-old men, and Ewan Fingar with impunity.
Sure. No, that's I'm laughing right now, but
I mean, it's like it's great. It's like he set it off very. This world is not nice, and if it's very brutal. And then in hindsight, you think of Two Rivers as like almost like the Shire, but it's not. You wouldn't want to be raised there.
Yeah,
I mean, but I think like the 10,000 foot view of the Shanchan, which is an extreme example of like culturally sanctioned abuse, right? Is where you have a traumatic event that then creates an abusive environment, right? And that's something we see like in family systems too, where you have perhaps a parent or two parents who were deeply traumatized, never processed that trauma in a healthy way, and then that becomes fodder for abuse. And that creates generational trauma. And so with the Shanchan, you have this hugely traumatic event that was channeled into a very abusive and corrupt way of ruling. And then you get the slavery, and you get the violent rulers, with all the kids killing each other, wanting to kill each other to gain control of the throne. So I just think that's a really interesting example too of how dangerous and sometimes deadly unprocessed and untreated trauma can be.
Yeah.
We turn into Pat and Fane.
Yeah.
Oh, geesh. Yeah. I mean, Pat and Fane, when it comes to what trauma was inflicted upon him. Yeah. I mean, and this goes back to that, like, do people deserve trauma if they're terrible people, right? It makes us question, our humanity a little bit, right? Because there's a certain aspect where, I don't know, maybe those watching this, I would imagine there are people that we might have said before that deserved certain things to happen to them, certain traumas, certain violent events, if you will. That they deserved it because that's what they chose, if you will. A dark friend, per se. Look at Pat and Fane, and he became the hound of the Dark One, right?
Yeah.
That, the way that Maureen explains it, she didn't even want to explain all the details, right? She was like, yeah, some terrible stuff happened, and this is the character we have as Pat and Fane. Even bringing up someone like that, to me, I've never thought about Pat and Fane that way, if you will. I've always just been like, yeah, he's an evil person,
He was distilled. Whatever that means.
Whatever that means. Yeah.
Whatever that means.
Yeah, that's horrible, right? Like, but that's what I mean is, and that's how the books begin. Like, that person shows up at the two rivers, and actually follows Rand. Tracks them down. Follows them to the eye of the world. So yeah, what an interesting. The whole book is beginning with this distilled, tortured person. There was one. Oh, sorry. Go ahead.
Well, it's just I'm just geeking out on this and thinking about this I hadn't thought about Pat and Fane from that too, but now, and again, once he comes in contact with Mordeth too, is that an example of compound trauma, where one traumatic experience not only builds on a previous traumatic experience, but almost kind of like fights against it in a way that fractures the person inside. And we see him kind of like written in that way, like his accent changes even as he's going through it. And so he's dealing with these multiple traumas that are like to the extreme that we can't even imagine what they mean, right? Like, what does it mean to have Mordeth get your soul?
Yeah.
What does it mean to be distilled? Now I feel sorry for him, actually.
I know. Well, Christine, do you think that Robert Jordan was wanting us to ask ourselves that question as readers, like, where's our humanity when it comes to how we judge and think about these characters? Someone like Pat and Fane, who's shattered as a person.
I mean, maybe. I honestly don't know. I mean, knowing that he went through Vietnam, right? I'm sure that he saw a lot of dehumanizing of people as a way to justify some of the horrible things that happened to them. But you're right. I think and I've never really thought about Pat and Fane this way. I'm really glad we're talking about it. I think when you hop on this narrative that bad people deserve for bad things to happen to them, we have to kind of ask ourselves, are we really helping things, right? Because if we do these horrible things to bad people, are they suddenly going to become good? Or is that just going to motivate them to then continue to do bad things? Because is it just going to amplify that negative aspect of their character and then cause them to lash out in a more vile manner? So are we really helping ourselves, or are we hurting society by hurting people who hurt other people, right? So someone like Pat and Fane, it seems like the more he's hurt, the more he hurts. And the worse he becomes, and the more it dehumanizes him and puts him in this mindset where he doesn't really care what he has to do in order to achieve his end goal. And it's weird because then with when he sort of absorbs Mordeth, it's almost like this dissociative identity takes place, where he really kind of is these two people. And so then how do you help heal someone who's going through something like that? Like, what do you do with that? And I think that's a really important question for us to ask ourselves. What do we do with people that we just don't want to be around, that we just don't want to deal with?
Yeah.
It's my personal belief that if I lived Pat and Fane's life, I would be Pat and Fane. That's always been, that's a belief system I carry around with me, and it informs my work, informs my relationships, that if I were you, if I saw everything you saw, I lived everything you lived, I would be doing the exact same thing you're doing, good or bad.
Mhm.
So
Sure.
to that end, if I were Pat and Fane, I'd want someone to help me. I wouldn't
Yeah.
want to be hurt. Yeah.
Well, yeah, because he does, if he does have, in other words, that pain is not something that he's gaining pleasure from, as in, at least from what I remember from the books, as in he whimpers when he thinks about those experiences, right? It's not like maybe the other side of that where he wants that pain, if you will. So yeah, what a fascinating question for us, I think, because there are so many of these trauma narratives, if you will. The one we haven't touched on, the Aes Sedai. I mean, the testing itself. Like, I don't know how to think about the testing, honestly. I don't have a good gauge for what I think about the Aes Sedai and just becoming Aes Sedai and what's required, because it feels like a very traumatic series of experiences to even gain the ring itself.
My partner, brother Dan, he has a theory that the testing in the Age of Legends was probably used to help people get over traumas. It was probably used as a benefit, but in this age, these dumb Aes Sedai are like, let's use it for this crazy reason, and it's arbitrary. It's kind of his belief, and I kind of see. I don't know the origins or the genesis of it, but I also feel like the White Tower is just a trauma factory, and it's unnecessary and it's brutal. And I think Robert Jordan makes sure we see it as such, and make sure we see it as a failed, flawed system of where they're training these people this way. So yeah, testing is brutal.
Yeah, and for me, it brings up something that started to percolate as we were talking about Pat and Fane too, is this idea of good and bad. And I think one of the things that comes up often in discussion about these books is that there's times where the books can feel fairly binary, right? Whether it's gendered or whether it's, there's good and then there's bad. And what we really see, especially when we talk about these traumatic things, is that it isn't as simple as being binary. There isn't such a thing as like a good person and a bad person. And I think sometimes we want to hold on to the idea that bad things happen to bad people and good things happen to good people. And that's not the way the world works. And I think that the Aes Sedai often hold themselves up as like, the pillar of good, right? The White Tower. And we get to, when we see the inner workings of it, I mean, that's the whole story arc of the White Tower, is that when we look inside, it's actually not that good, but it's really not that bad either, because they're trying to do good things. And there's like Elida is a really good example of someone who's, she's not evil, really. I mean, she's just, just makes some repeatedly bad decisions. And I mean, maybe we can go into the thing about being influenced by Pat and Fane, and then maybe she makes some different decisions after that and stuff. But really, like at the beginning, when we first meet her, has the best intentions at heart, but ends up hurting a lot of people from her actions.
By the way, we need to take a 15-second pause. If you're watching this show right now, Mickey just brought up a very nuanced, awesomely geeky piece of canon that if you might have missed it, and that just means total geek here. That's what that means. But to know that Pat and Fane might have had an influence on Elida, and that's, by the way, anyways, that was cool. Thank you for bringing that up. Yeah. Yes, so that is a very nuanced piece. But yes, again, our individual influence. Jordan does that so well in his writing. He shows the things that we miss, and that everyone else misses. And we just look at them and we go, well, that's a stupid thing, or that's an evil person, or how could they have ever made that decision? I wouldn't have made that decision. How many times have we said the same words, even tonight, if these boys would just communicate? but how many of us are not communicating with somebody out there that we're pissed at, or or that we have trauma based on, or we come up with some. In other words, Jordan's really good, I feel like, at painting a pretty realistic, like this wasn't. Everyone doesn't just kind of process trauma really well, and and like it's really common. I mean, Rand, we're talking about all the things that happened to him. That was only a couple years, like, and he processed eventually. He did move through and eventually come out in a good place a couple years later. That's actually a pretty good arc. We see all the terrible things that are happening to him, but when I think of trauma in my own life or in lives of others, it's not at least for me, my experience, it's like a quick thing. You just deal with it, you process it, but that leaning in process takes time. So yeah, I love that you brought that up, because we do influence each other, and trauma is part of the human experience, which is hopefully what, if you're still here watching with us, hopefully that is coming across. I hope we are helping to normalize that conversation among fans and the books, which is, this is actually a human experience. Like, this is part of our experience, and we should talk about it, and we should be asking questions. But sorry, I took us down a tangent there, but but yes, the overall White Tower itself, look at they tell people you might not come back.
Yeah.
Just walk in here. You want this thing, you might not come back.
Well, that's their informed consent.
What's that? I think that's true. Yeah, but they don't tell them until right in that. Right, as far as I remember, like, aren't there some things?
Yeah,
it's like
you're,
right in
you're
that
already
moment,
naked.
Yeah. Bye.
Yeah, you can leave now. And you only get one more chance or something to come back and try this again. And then you're kicked out. And it seems like one of the things that Egwene does not like, and Egwene fights against, is some of these things where she's like, this is unnecessary. Why wouldn't you embrace anyone who wants to be part of the White Tower? Why wouldn't we find a place for them? Why are we diminishing them as individuals? It's a really interesting, again, Egwene is part of some traumatic experiences of others too, but there are some interesting things that she does, and I see some positivity about how she handles trauma.
Well, if we could go back a little bit to Elida, actually, and so I think Jordan did a really good job of creating these mirror characters, right? So you have Elida and Nynaeve, I think, are pretty decent examples of mirror characters, where you have two people who are trying very hard to be strong, and that manifests itself in a rigidity. And so what happens with Nynaeve's story arc is that she becomes more flexible and becomes less rigid, and that benefits her. Whereas Elida stays in that place of rigidity, and it just works against her over and over and over again. And then Egwene comes in, and Egwene is much more flexible, right? She's much more accepting of the trauma that happened to her. She uses it to grow as an individual and to become more aware of what's going on around her instead of internalizing everything. And so then Elida and Egwene almost become these two faces of the White Tower, right? Where you have this rigidity that kind of isn't really working anymore for people. And then you have this new person who comes in and offers more of this idea of acceptance and flexibility and moving beyond, our hurts and our traumas and stuff. So. Yeah,
I didn't think about that. That's good. It's almost like Jordan is telling the reader how he thinks that you resolve some of these issues. That he does have a belief, and he is putting that belief into the books, that this rigidity is part of the problem. And that's how I'm reading it.
It's not an evil person. Like Mickey said, she's not an evil person. Her motivations, I think, are actually quite pure. She wants to make the world a more beautiful place. That's part of her obsession with flowers, right? Is that she wants to make the world a more beautiful place. However, she's extremely rigid, and she's not open to other people's points of view. She's not, she cannot handle not being right all the time. And that can be very harmful to the individual who's rigid, and then also to the people who are sort of in their sphere of influence.
Yeah, Ryan, is this a theme that you hope that Rafe and his team are able to move into the books themselves, that they don't miss this kind of
Absolutely.
rigidity, and
Yeah.
that we see that and we see the problems with it.
I hope he does that, and I think that's gonna really challenge the acting and the writing for sure. Like, if these actors can really demonstrate real change, I think we're going to really be happy with the product. But it's really going to be, for me, over everything else, is going to be really based on whether these actors can convince me that they're changing, and I think they will. But I think, yeah, they're going to have to, like, yeah, the rigidity, the inability to handle things like proactively, positively, all of these things, I think is gonna, yeah, I mean, it's so integral to these characters. It would have to come out.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I hope that is when they talk about getting the themes, we talk about balance a lot, as one of them, but I hope that they get this balance right, which is that we do, I don't know, it sounds weird maybe, but that we see that there's trauma, right? And that we see the reaction to those trauma in the writing itself, because hopefully that's something this entire conversation has me thinking, like, that it's never a way I've thought about the books, but it's just I think it's really well done by Jordan here. Not something I talk about that I give him credit for. I just have enjoyed the books, but I've never looked at it this way, and I think it'll always have changed the way now that I read the books when I see people experiencing these things, and I ask, like, why are they handling it this way? How are they handling it? And I feel stupid because it's like Rand needs to laugh again. Rand needs to laugh again. Like some brought up in chat and it's like, yeah, he needs to laugh again, whatever. As a reader, I remember being like, yeah, he'll get there, save the world, whatever. But how personal it becomes, when you start taking it this way. Anyway, sorry. Very cool. Sorry, Mickey, go ahead. I don't know if you were to say something.
Well, yeah, it's just, I mean, yeah, I'm just thinking about all the characters we haven't talked about yet. I'm thinking about our other two boys, right? Matt and Perrin. And Perrin, I think, for me, really is another example of that, like, flexibility to begin with, but then like the fight against being a wolf brother is one of the things that he's going through, but it really isn't until, like, he loses his family and then he loses Fail. And then we see rigidity really hit for Perrin. He becomes hyper focused and really obsessed with getting Fail back. And I think that's really, it's not, it's bigger than Fail. It's about more than that. It's about all of these other things that he's gone through, this loss of his family, this, like, loss of identity, all of this other thing, all of his identity gets funneled into Fail. And just having this conversation makes me appreciate his story a little bit more than I have in the past.
Yeah, that's a good one to think about. Yeah, I hadn't asked myself that question of just, does everyone have this arc of dealing with trauma, especially the younger individuals in the books, where rigidity becomes kind of that initial push, or does it come later, and how do they? You brought up Matt too. Is there something there that you saw with trauma with Matt, or his arc when it comes to trauma in his experiences?
Yeah, I think Matt, right? Matt plays the clown, and I think sometimes humor is one of those things that can be a really positive coping strategy. We talk about Rand needing to laugh, right? He needs a little more humor in his life, but I think Matt is a very nice example of where he takes that lightheartedness as a coping strategy that maybe prevents him from really processing the trauma. Like, he just, takes things a little, not too lightly, but stays in that easygoing way. But he, and I want to be delicate around Matt's trauma, because, I mean, we can talk about going through the doorway and everything he experiences there, but I think the one that gets brought up the most in the fandom is with Tylan, where he is in that forced relationship with her. And I know that there's some debate within the fan community as to what that looks like. I mean, from my perspective, it's traumatic. I will just say that that's a traumatic experience, and he doesn't process it, and he kind of just plays it off. And I think that ends up hurting him in the long run.
Yeah. It's so interesting because you talked about this right at the beginning, which you brought up this idea of one strategy doesn't necessarily work for everyone, and you can take a strategy and then lose it or misuse it, if you will. and how interesting that Jordan has us, look at Rand of the laugh again kind of concept. You're like, yes, he really could use this. And you're like, Matt, no, you're like the laughing again is not how you handle this situation. And yeah, his relationship with Tylen and this assault, and Jordan put that in there for us to see, and how Matt addresses it almost echoes how some, as fans, we like, oh, Matt's laughing. Okay. So, so you think about that in your own life, and you're like, well, they laughed it off. So it's clearly not trauma. This isn't something that affects them or means something to them because they're laughing about it. And so how interesting that juxtaposition that Jordan offers us in the books to how we personally address drama and how we should not read into one person addressing drama one way means the same thing for everybody. Anyway, that's speaking to Matt's, is there anything else that anyone want to bring up about Matt and Tylen before we moved on from there?
No, but just that, I mean, it's common knowledge that, just because Matt is the male in that dynamic, that it's still not okay. So that, I hope that's not an issue that we need to be like impressing home. Like,
yeah, right. Again, I know as you brought up, Mickey, this idea of like, yeah, some people disagree with that, but regardless of what fans think, it's very much everyone tries to read the room and go like, okay, I can be okay because that person seems like they're okay. Which I think just speaks about us and our own traumatic experiences than it says about what's happening there necessarily. So now I know we're kind of getting close to the end of this episode. Hopefully, if people are still watching us, I see some chat moving along here. I can tell there's some good conversations going on there. Please do like this video so other fans can find it later. Love for fans to come back, watch this, and hopefully leave a comment. Not about their personal traumatic stories, please don't do that, but leave a comment about if you'd like us to continue having these kind of conversations. What would you like to see us address? Is it particular character discussions, or just things that might have, maybe you had an aha moment, like Christine brought up during this, and you're like, oh yeah, this really, I look at the books differently. We'd love to hear that in the comments of this video afterwards. What I thought I'd do at this point, I don't want to ignore, there's so many characters we could jump into, of course, but I wanted to go and go around once here. Is there anyone else you want to bring up for a discussion about their own kind of trauma narratives before we do kind of close up today? And maybe I'll start with you, Ryan. Is there any one person or a particular society, whatever it is, that we haven't really discussed at this point that you want to bring up?
Can I give me 1 second?
Yeah, I put you on the spot.
I had a whole other wrap up going on in my head.
Gotcha.
Book, so.
Christine, is there one that's standing out to you that we didn't bring up that you thought would be kind of interesting to speak about before we end the show today?
I mean, I guess I would say more gaze is one that comes to mind.
Okay.
Which, and actually talking about Matt and Tylen is what sort of made me think about that. She's someone who also experienced trauma, and we assume, right, sexual trauma, and the way that she dealt with it or was forced to deal with it. I think the way that Matt sort of laughed off what happened to him because of just how his experience was framed, right? We have this sort of expectation that men can't be the victims of sexual aggression at the hands of women, which is not true. And so part of the way that he dealt with that publicly was to laugh about it, right? Because when you have experienced the trauma, you don't want to make other people around you uncomfortable. And I think for Matt, that's sort of the identity that he embraced, is that he's someone who's fun, he's someone who's lighthearted, even though we know his internal narrative is very different. He does worry about stuff. He does have a hard time with some things. That's just not what he presents to other people. Whereas with more gaze, it's the people around her who minimize what's happening, right? They're the ones who make her question herself when she knows that there's something wrong, she knows that everything is not okay, but then all the people who are around who should be supporting her are not. They're humiliating her, they're laughing at her, they're making her feel like she's overreacting. So I just think it's interesting the way that we view sexual aggression through the lens of whether it's a man or it's a woman experiencing it is problematic. And I'm glad that he showed those two different lenses of how we can, either vilify someone who's a victim or just completely ignore that they could even possibly be one.
Yeah.
Based on their gender. So.
Yeah, that's a good highlight. Yeah, I appreciate that thought. Anyone else have any thoughts on that before I go back to Ryan? What Christine just brought up.
It's a really good point.
It's always great, yeah. And that's a good message also. Thank you, Christine.
Yeah.
So the one character that might be nice to talk about before we wrap up would be Aram, and how he completely switched his identity and became a warrior, took up the sword after the death of his mom. He felt like he could have saved her. He was racked with guilt. I think he's a fascinating character too. We don't see the parallels. Well, I mean, we see as many thousands of the Aiel just kind of like wander off, like depressed when they find out, but we don't really follow them and see what their lives like after they change. But we see Aram change from the beginning, and we watch his whole arc. I thought that was really fascinating.
Yeah, and that mixes in with the whole story about the Aiel and and the Tinkers and almost seeing it kind of happen again for this individual, right? The decision to walk away from this life that he was involved in, or this group, society, and what that means to him, and looking for another society, looking for another group, and I feel some empathy for Aram. He feels very lonely, and I almost feel, now I could be wrong. It's been a while since I've really focused on that story, but it doesn't. I mean, I know Perrin kind of embraces him a bit, but I never got the feeling like Perrin was like, "Yeah, I'm gonna be this. We're gonna be." I don't know. He just feel like he kind of was like, "Cool, yeah, do your thing. We'll be together." But it didn't seem like Aram ever felt apart. So that's one I want to go back and read about more now with this kind of new lens, because I think I would find more empathy for him than I've had in the past. So.
And that's what this is all about, right?
Yeah, right. Well, hopefully people that are watching right now or have watched this, like, that's the point. Like, where is your empathy? You probably felt it for some. Not like, don't you have empathy? The idea of, have you looked at these characters with empathy and the traumatic events that they've passed through, and have you ever put that lens on for the books? And I think that's a really fascinating question for us all to ask, because I hadn't really, honestly. So, Mickey, I know you brought up Matt and Perrin. Was there anybody else you wanted to bring up before we end up today?
Yeah, since we're talking about building empathy, how about Gawain? Like,
of course you're gonna bring up Gawain. That is, by the way, that is the perfect way to end this. Oh gosh, I feel bad because I'm laughing. I'm like, but go ahead, tell me the trauma about Gawain. I'll try to get back in my mindset. But yes,
I thought I was gonna get through this without traumatizing me.
Sorry.
This conversation has made me think of it about, like, how do I think about him differently? And I'll own, like, on my current reread, I'm just at the point in Gathering Storm where he's really, like, he's processing what it means that he murdered his mentor. And for him, that is the trauma. And that he's talking to another warder who basically says, if you didn't kill him, he was going to kill you. Like, one of you was dying in there. And so that's, I think, one of, like, his core trauma. But what's interesting about him, and I think what makes it hard to hold empathy for him, is that he deflects all of his feelings, right? He pushes it out onto Rand, and he hates Rand, and he wants Rand dead. But I really think that it's really a lot of anger that he has towards himself. He feels guilty for leaving Elaine and not being there to protect her like he's supposed to, but feeling trapped and not being able to follow this path that he's been told. So if we talk about childhood trauma, I mean, he had a sword put in his hand as a toddler and was told, you have to protect this little girl, like with your life. And how do you like grow up like that? And then I think that breaking point for him with Tamar, where it's going to make me finish this reread looking at him maybe just a little bit differently. We'll see what the next couple of books bring after this conversation.
Yeah, well, because this always comes up, the way things end with Rand is great. But if you just take Rand up to that point before his change, Rand isn't necessarily the startling, panacea of, love and care for everyone. Rand's not. I mean, Rand's done some stuff that that we're all like, yeah, but the taint and all these other things. We find empathy often for people that we like, and
excuses.
We are absent empathy for people we don't like, and I think this book is a great microcosm of that effect that happens, and you see that. Someone brought up, fandom does bully Gawain, because it feels fun, like we're going to bully this person we all, or we collectively loathe. And I think there is an absence there of maybe critical examination of that character and understanding that character. So yeah, I again, this is going to make me kind of go back and read characters like Lanfear, one of my favorite. I'm gonna try to read Lanfear with more.
Even go into her.
I know we didn't talk. I'm just saying I'm gonna try to read her with more empathy than I already do. She's one of my favorites. So, but I'm sure I could reach a greater level of empathy there. Sorry, go ahead, Ryan.
Well, I mean, it's kind of the whole message of the series. If you think about Rand's interactions with the Dark One at the end, spoilers, right? Wasn't he empathizing? Didn't he just see him for the true being that it was, and almost loved it? So, I mean, if Rand can do it with the Dark One, I could do it with my neighbor. I could do it with these characters in the book. Everyone can do it with their neighbors. Everyone can expand their empathy, and the world would be a better place.
Yeah, I think we can end right there. That was good. That was a good statement.
Smash Black.
Well, let me. By the way, thank you three for showing up for this. This was a lot of fun to kind of look at the books a lot differently than I had, and I appreciate your experiences, both personal and professional, that came into this discussion. I'm sure there's a lot more. I saw lots of questions going by that we weren't able to answer in chat. Just to kind of talk about this topic. Hopefully this is just the first time we just push the topic out there. This continues the conversation that Ryan, that you were having on The Way of the Leaf, and hopefully this becomes more common. I hope, because the TV show is coming out, and I'm hoping our conversations can be a little bit more interesting about what we like or dislike about the show, by hopefully great writing that's brought into a lot of these aspects that Robert Jordan has into these characters. And yeah, so this has been really great. Master of the Deck, thank you for bringing this up as a suggestion for an episode here at the Dusty Wheel. Any final thoughts? Let me start with you, Christine. Any final thoughts you want to leave viewers with or the panel before we end the day?
Honestly, I think Ryan summed it up. I mean, if Rand can have empathy for the Dark One, then maybe we can all find a little more empathy for other people too. We don't necessarily have to be friends with them or like them, but we can be empathetic and understand that, we're all having our own experiences. Sometimes we have our experiences with other people, and we have to just kind of respect that and be respectful of the space that we're all sharing. So. Yeah,
no, I appreciate that. And Ryan, since you ended, I'm going to skip you because you already had a great thought to end us off there. Mickey, any final thoughts to leave us with?
I guess the one thought I'm having too is, I think the message that I'm getting out of this too is that we're not alone. You're not alone if you've experienced trauma. You're not alone in your experience with these characters, and that there's something about this shared experience that can be really powerful.
Yeah, this is great. That's great. And yeah, and just me, I just want to add on to that point, which is hopefully, again, we can continue talking about this and not just talk but lean into kind of processing the trauma that we're individually feeling or experiencing or have experienced. And hopefully this has given someone out there, a way to frame their experiences in a way that they can let them move from that kind of hunkering. That's the only word I can remember.
Bracing.
Bracing. Concept. I don't know why hunkering is there, but it is. And actually see that there is, hope that you can process through these traumas. And yes, The Wheel of Time might not be the book you go to gain that hope per se, but it is a really interesting look at Robert Jordan's given us, looking at trauma and how we process it as very unique individuals. So please do, again, leave us some comments afterwards. Let us know if you'd like us to tackle something else, or tackle different individuals or parts of this conversation, or if there's questions that you did have. Please do look into the resources that we left in the description. Like I said, if you are looking for support in this regard, for traumatic events you've experienced, and please don't minimize them. Trauma is not just what maybe 4 to 9%, like Mickey brought up, need more clinical help to address. It does affect basically everyone. So you are not alone, and please do seek out after help for things that you might be suffering with. So with that being said, thank you three. Really appreciate this. It's a great Sunday afternoon here at the Dusty Wheel. So with that being said, good afternoon from the Dusty Wheel, and smash to black.
Welcome to the Dusty Wheel.
Hey, welcome back to the Dusty Wheel. You went right to kill it. Look at you, you're all ready. You're just done. I mean, this is like
turned out really well. And now I'm like, great, my turn.
And if you don't like that, you want to say, well, Robert Jordan could have made the two rivers all white. He could have, but he didn't. So
just complimented me on my dress, and as you can clearly see, I'm not wearing white.
I see Naomi as something along the lines of a Shida Haran analog.
It does make sense why it outlasted the breaking.
Yeah.
See, this is why I have Therese in the show, because she's going to correct everything that.
Hey everybody, welcome to the Dusty Wheel Show. What? Meme Off Challenge. Yay!
Like baby face mounted on like a huge body. So like all of a sudden,
This is not just
like,
a traditional fantasy, right? There are sci-fi
and
elements.
Just a moment ago, Rafe tweeted something. So let me get my guest in here with me. And
probably, I would say, put in 70, 80% of the work. I got to be over the shoulder and be like, no,